Wyatt never thought his perfect marriage would come crashing down so suddenly. But one unexpected discovery forced him to question everything about his wife, and everything he thought he knew about their love. Wyatt is 38 years old and works as a software developer in Chicago. He's always considered himself a simple man, dedicated to his job, his friends, and above all, his wife. Mia, 36, is a successful lawyer who's always been driven, ambitious, and smart. They met in college, and their connection was instant. They got married shortly after graduation, and for 7 years, they built a life together that Wyatt believed was flawless. They shared everything: dreams, goals, even struggle. Life was good. Mia's career was thriving, and Wyatt admired her ambition. He was proud of her success and fully supported her long hours at work and frequent business trips. For the first few years, their marriage was full of laughter, love, and shared experiences. But over time, things began to change. At first, Wyatt chalked it up to work stress. Mia's increasing hours at the office, constant travel, and late nights didn't seem unusual, until the subtle signs of distance grew too loud to ignore. What seemed like a perfect marriage was starting to feel empty. Something was off, but Wyatt couldn't put his finger on it. At first glance, everything in Wyatt and Mia's life seemed perfect. They had a beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood, a comfortable lifestyle, and a strong, loving relationship. They shared weekend hikes, intimate dinners, and spontaneous adventures. Life was easy, or so Wyatt thought. But in the past year, subtle cracks began to show. Mia's career had taken off, which meant more business trips, more late nights, and less time for the two of them. At first, Wyatt didn't mind. He supported her ambitions, and after all, this was part of the deal. But as her travels became more frequent, Wyatt began to notice things that unsettled him. Phone calls that once lasted for hours were now brief and impersonal. Text messages were curt, lacking the warmth they once shared. She'd come home late, often claiming work had kept her longer than expected, only to retreat to her office to work on presentations. Their once easy conversations felt forced. Wyatt tried to brush it off, convincing himself it was just the stress of Mia's growing responsibilities. Yet, a sense of unease grew in him with every passing day. He tried to ignore it. After all, he loved her and believed in their marriage. But the emotional distance between them was undeniable, and deep down, he feared it might be the beginning of something worse. It was a rainy Thursday evening when Wyatt's suspicions first bubbled to the surface. Mia had just returned from a week-long trip to New York, and as usual, she seemed distracted. Her greetings were brief, a quick kiss on the cheek as she dropped her suitcase at the door, barely looking up from her phone. Wyatt thought he'd made dinner for them to reconnect, but Mia barely touched her plate. As they sat together, Wyatt casually asked, "How was the trip? Did everything go well with the client?" Mia paused, looking at him with an odd expression. "Yeah, it was fine," she said, her voice flat. But something in the way she said it, the hesitation, made Wyatt's stomach twist. Normally, she would have gone into detail about her meetings, excited to share all the little stories. But tonight she was different, distant, almost cold. She excused herself to take a call in another room, her usual excuse when she didn't want to talk. But Wyatt couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He wondered for the first time if his instincts were right. Maybe this wasn't just the pressures of work, but something deeper. As the night wore on, Wyatt's thoughts began to spiral. Could it be that Mia was hiding something? He wanted to dismiss the thought, to tell himself it was just paranoia, but a nagging feeling wouldn't let him forget it. His instincts told him to question everything. But should he confront her now, or wait for more evidence? It was a Saturday afternoon when Wyatt's worst fears were confirmed. He had returned home early from a business meeting and decided to surprise Mia. He had hoped to spend some quality time together, but when he stepped into their bedroom, he was greeted by a sight that would change everything. Mia's suitcase was open on the bed, her clothes strewn carelessly around. But as Wyatt moved to tidy up, something caught his eye. a small, unmarked box tucked beneath a pile of scarves in her bag. His heart pounded in his chest as he pulled it out. Inside were condoms, something that hadn't been part of their life for years. Wyatt's mind raced. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mia had always been adamant about not needing them. They had never used them after the first few years of their marriage, preferring to rely on other methods. So why were they here? His hands trembled as he fumbled with the box, the words written on it blurring as his emotions surged. Betrayal. Confusion. Anger. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Was she cheating on him? Did she bring someone else into their home? Or was this just a mistake? Wyatt couldn't think clearly. All he knew was that the discovery had shattered something deep inside him. He didn't know what to do. But in that moment, driven by raw emotion and a desperate need to reclaim some sense of control, he made a choice. Without thinking, he grabbed a needle from the drawer and began to puncture each condom. One by one, he destroyed them, his hands shaking with fury. Suspense and anger clouded his judgment as he left the room, unsure of what would happen next, but certain that everything had changed. The days following the discovery were a blur of emotions for Wyatt. The anger from what he'd found was still fresh, but it was mingled with a deep sense of guilt. He had acted on impulse, destroyed the evidence that could have clarified the truth, and now he was left with nothing but a mess of shattered trust and suspicion. What if Mia hadn't done anything wrong? What if he'd overreacted? The thought gnawed at him. But even then, the sting of betrayal still burned, and part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Mia returned from a trip to London a few days later, acting as if nothing had changed. She greeted him with a hug, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was almost as if she was trying too hard to appear normal. Wyatt watched her closely, searching for any hint of guilt or unease, but found nothing. She was the same Mia, charming, affectionate, and distant all at once. Wyatt's behavior, however, had shifted. He had become quieter, more withdrawn. His eyes no longer followed her with the same warmth. He was hyper-aware of every little thing she did, from the way she brushed past him without looking at him to the long phone calls she took in another room. His suspicion grew. Mia's behavior was becoming more erratic. She would leave the room for phone calls, often returning flushed, as if she'd been caught in a lie. Wyatt noticed her secrecy, how she held her phone with a kind of protectiveness that made his stomach churn. But he still didn't confront her. He couldn't. The fear of facing the truth, of knowing what she had done, was too much to bear. Instead, he watched her, waiting for the moment when everything would come to a head. The tension between them was palpable, yet neither of them spoke of it. It was another business trip that pushed Wyatt to the brink. Mia had to fly to Paris for a client meeting, a quick 2-day trip. Wyatt watched her leave, a growing unease in his chest. He knew deep down that this wouldn't be just another work trip. His suspicion had reached a boiling point, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, when Mia was away, Wyatt took it upon himself to dig deeper. He had already gone through her things once, but this time he needed something more, something undeniable. It wasn't until he overheard her on the phone in the other room that everything changed. Her voice was softer than usual, playful almost, and Wyatt could make out bits and pieces of the conversation. "I can't wait to see you again. When you're back in town, we'll figure it out." The words pierced through him like a blade. Mia's tone was intimate, filled with a tenderness that he hadn't heard in a long time. His heart pounded in his chest as he listened, feeling the betrayal seeping into his bones. This wasn't business talk. This wasn't just a friendly conversation. This was something far worse. The tension in the room was suffocating as Wyatt stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. He had been waiting for the truth, but now that it was within reach, he couldn't decide if he was ready to confront Mia. The uncertainty paralyzed him. Should he face her now or wait for more undeniable evidence? The next evening, Mia returned from her trip and found Wyatt sitting in the living room, waiting for her. His expression was different, cold, distant. The moment she stepped in, Wyatt didn't hesitate. "Who's Antonio?" he asked. his voice a mix of anger and desperation. Mia's face went pale. She stood frozen, her lips parted as though searching for the right words, but none came. After a long, painful silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen, Wyatt. I'm so sorry." Wyatt's heart shattered as she confessed. Mia had been seeing Antonio, a colleague from one of her business trips. The emotional weight of her words hit Wyatt like a tidal wave. The woman he had trusted, the woman he thought he knew, had betrayed him. Shock, disbelief, and anger coursed through him as he realized the depth of her betrayal. In that moment, something inside him broke. The days after the confrontation were filled with a mixture of numbness and grief. Mia's confession had shattered the illusion of their perfect marriage, leaving Wyatt lost in a sea of emotions. They talked, but the conversation was futile. There was no going back to what they once had, no easy way to repair the damage. Wyatt found himself wondering whether the relationship could ever be saved. Could trust be rebuilt after such a betrayal? The love he once felt for Mia now felt tainted, fragile, like a piece of glass ready to shatter at any moment. But more than that, he began questioning himself. Had his suspicions, his impulsive actions, like tampering with the condoms, made things worse? He'd sought revenge, but all it did was deepen the hole between them. Wyatt realized that retaliating against Mia had only fed his anger, not brought him peace. Revenge, he now understood, didn't lead to closure. It just added more pain to an already broken heart. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could control how he moved forward. As he looked at the wreckage of his marriage, Wyatt realized he needed to focus on healing, even if that meant leaving the past behind. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He couldn't stay in a relationship built on lies. Moving on was the only choice left, though it felt like the hardest one.